I was in real danger of losing my whimsy. I was 30 years old, a computer programmer. My imaginative outlets were few and far between. And then I discovered this place. My name is Zach Jarrett, and I'm president of the board of directors at Valley of the Moon. I discovered Valley of the Moon late. I grew up in Tucson. I was born and raised here, and I never knew Valley of the Moon existed. I would ride my bike down Prince Road and occasionally see these hand-painted signs that said Valley of the Moon. And I never worked up enough curiosity about it to come and discover the place. So about 4 years ago, one of our neighbor's children was in the Haunted Ruins show, and we came to see it, and we were just enchanted by Valley of the Moon. When we came through the enchanted garden, there was a beautiful fairy princess sitting right here, singing a song and wishing us good luck on our travels. And when we left that night, I kept thinking about Valley of the Moon. It kept coming up over and over and over again in conversation. And I've since learned that there's a name for this. When you visit Valley of the Moon and then can't get it out of your head, it's called being moonstruck. And the chief result of this is that those people who are moonstruck often come back and help Valley of the Moon run for a year or a couple of years or a couple of decades.
The way to get to Valley of the Moon is to head out of Tucson, look for the glow in the sky. My name is Jenny Sunshine, and I am the Vice President of the George Farr Legler Society. Valley of the Moon is a historic fairyland. It is for fairies, for children, for adults. It's also a metaphysical healing center. It consists of 23 historic structures that George built in the 1920s to 1930s and exists today to spark imagination of children and to promote kindness.
So Valley of the Moon was built by a gentle, eccentric old man, George Legler, who started building Valley of the Moon in his middle years. I'm most fascinated by the fact that here was this man who cared more for the world around him than he cared for himself. When he started working on Valley of the Moon, he hired hobos, itinerant men who were traveling across the country during the Great Depression to help him work at Valley of the Moon. And he could never afford to pay them, but he could afford to give them food and give them a place to stay while they worked on the property.
He was a very creative man. He was a unique guy who was probably an oddball in any environment that he was in.
But George was a very special person. George was celebrated as a folk hero by Life magazine.
I think that there is no more heartwarming story to Tucson than the story of a fellow who spent all of his money to create a place in the Depression to spark the imagination of children and to promote kindness.
He lived in poverty here. From the moment he started work, every nickel he had went into Valley of the Moon, building this place that was a gift to the city of Tucson and a gift to childhood in general. And I am most enchanted by the selfless nature of everything that George did, and the fact that one person in a dedicated lifetime can build so much and have such a rich impact on the world.
Tuberculosis was ravaging the population out here, and Tucson actually took that to its advantage by promoting folks to come to Tucson to recover from tuberculosis. It was thought at the time that tuberculosis would be cured by fresh air and sunlight. Unfortunately, that didn't always work, especially for young people. If you were young or elderly and you got consumption, it was very likely that you would end up perishing. George was aware of a neighbor child who had tuberculosis. And mind you, back in the day, there weren't very many neighbors. There were originally only 4 neighbors in this area. We're not sure exactly what home that child came from, but she was a young teenager. And I've heard several stories about it, but the most compelling is that when George visited this gal, he noticed that she, from her bedside, could see a window with either nothing there or trash cans there. Those were the 2 stories that I've heard. And he thought that that was a pretty terrible thing. See, here's this person dying, and her last vision is going to be just of suffering and having this window to nothing. So what he did is he built basically a window vignette that had a whole mountain in it. It had a hillside that had a wheelbarrow track. On the top it had a reservoir where if you put 2 gallons of water in the top in the morning, it would run down into a waterfall the entire day. And he told her that this is a little fairy village, that if pain, suffering, or boredom ever got too much, she could, in her imagination, always go to this magical site. All she had to do is look out her window into this window box. And that was a great success. This really helped her get through her experience and her sickness. And George ended up going around building more window boxes for sick children throughout the community, until eventually, I think it must have occurred to him, why do you have to be sick?
Once upon a time, Valley of the Moon was known by everybody in the city of Tucson, or most everybody had at least heard of Valley of the Moon, even if they hadn't personally visited. For thousands of children, this is an important part of their childhood experience. And George tried to teach children to be kind before they were 5 or 6 years old, with the idea that if you taught a child to be kind, that they would grow up to be kind and teach it to their children.
I think the most important part of Valley of the Moon's history was George's focus on kindness. I think it's very important to remember kindness, especially with people getting so into themselves and forgetting the world around them. So I think the most important part is that George taught everyone kindness and was kind to everybody, and that we continue to teach kindness. My name is Stephanie Johnston, and I'm the treasurer here at Valley of the Moon. George meant it to be a mental health place for mental healing, and I think that does help a lot of people with that. I know one lady here who found it very healing after the death of her husband. I think when people find Valley of the Moon, it's not always on purpose. And so those people who find Valley of the Moon by accident are the people who need Valley of the Moon the most.
This is the magical heart of a magical storybook land. And as an adult, I can come to Valley of the Moon and be whimsical and imaginative and playful again. I mean, how long has it been since you pretended with your friends for fun? And you can do that at Valley of the Moon. So from an adult perspective, Valley of the Moon is a place to reconnect with childhood.
It's my village. You know, we don't have a village anymore, but they used to say it takes a village to raise a child. Most people don't have that. I have it now. And I think that's really important here at Valley of the Moon.
Well, George was doing tours starting in 1932, basically through when he went to a nursing home in the 70s. But the time that was really hopping here would have been in the 40s and the 50s. In the 1948 was the beginning of Bunnyland Theater. Bunnyland Theater was a performing vaudeville act of rabbits. The rabbits were dressed in costumes, and George bred and trained them for this purpose. At one point there were 20 rabbits performing, and they did things such as they had a vignette where one rabbit would go up the side of a hotel and rescue another rabbit from a burning hotel, or one rabbit was an aviator rabbit who would fly through the air, I think on cables, I hope. These rabbits would be conducting a whole circus for children, and it actually went on the road and was featured in some magazines such as Look and Life. George's tours for children typically involved going through the facility and lighting kerosene lanterns, doing magic tricks throughout. The children would follow him throughout Valley of the Moon in the night and be told that this was going to be a magical tour, and they may see magical creatures. And it really was a time for George to help these children understand that every child was a special and kind child themselves, and to promote messages of kindness.
From a childhood perspective, Valley of the Moon is a place where children fully can be children and can believe in magic. And maybe, if they're very, very lucky, they'll see a fairy here. I haven't yet, but maybe I just haven't been lucky enough.
We're not really sure how things wound down out here at Valley of the Moon. We do know that we went into a lull in the 60s. One of the things that probably happened is that Frank, George's good friend and the secretary of the Valley of the Moon Memorial Society, which is the nonprofit that George started to protect Valley of the Moon, had passed away. The other thing is that it seemed like with things going on in the world, my guess is Vietnam and fairies did not mix as well as the interests of children may have changed a little bit in the world. George's health was also failing. George was always a frail man. He was small. He was on disability for a good part of his career in Tucson. He had an accident that was alternatively reported as a bicycle going off of a hill or a car going off of a hillside that injured his stomach, and he believed that the only thing he could consume was evaporated milk and vitamins. And I think living on that for 20 years had its toll, and he ended up becoming fairly frail. He did continue to do tours when people would show up on his doorstep, like with the Catalina kids, when we had folks from Catalina High School felt they rediscovered George and picked the whole operation back up in the early 70s. In the early 1970s, there were several Catalina High School students who were arguing amongst themselves about this dream that they were having. They were having this dream about wizards' towers and fairies and all kinds of crazy things about a wizard that wore dark. And they thought it was really strange and maybe mystical that they had the same dream. One of them told a parent about this coincidence that they were all having the same dream, and she said, "Oh, that's just silly. That's Valley of the Moon. I took you there when you were little." So a group of Catalina High School students basically came over and trespassed to find Valley of the Moon again, and they did find Valley of the Moon, and they found George, and George realized that these were children that he had taken around Valley of the Moon many years ago. And so he took them on a 2-hour tour, and by the end of that 2-hour tour, the kids became committed to wanting to help Valley of the Moon, because at that point, there was some neglect. The bushes were all overhanging the paths, and there was a lot to be done. The volunteerism had not been there for a while, and the Catalina kids basically took charge. They went from being trespassers out for a good experience to being totally responsible. They took care of George. They called him Uncle George when he fell down and broke a hip. They took turns watching him on a schedule. And some of them even moved in here and basically helped Valley of the Moon reopen, clean the place up.
Valley of the Moon is a community-centric organization. We've had community theater happening here for years, for 40 years. Valley of the Moon offers a connection to our shared cultural heritage. There are tens of thousands of children who came through during the 30s and 40s and 50s, and of course they're grandparents today, and so they've taught their children about Valley of the Moon and brought their children here.
I really like Valley of the Moon because there's lots of cool things to do here, like our Halloween shows and the spring shows, and they're really fun. And it's sort of nice because it means I get to see my grandmother more often because she's on the board here.
And their children's children have taught their children about Valley of the Moon and brought their children here.
I really like Valley of the Moon. I've been going here since I was like 5 years old. I think it's a really cool, magical place, especially at nighttime with all the lights. And when we do fairy stuff, it's like my favorite because I love fairies.
We have children coming today, little kids, whose parents came, whose parents came, whose parents came to Valley of the Moon.
A garden of serenity in the middle of Tucson. I love it. That's all.
And so this is a very real part of Tucson's shared cultural heritage. And it's important that we celebrate that and that we protect Tucson's cultural heritage.
I am Admiral Blackfire, and this property is under the Federation Historical Preservation Society.
About 6 years ago, we had an architectural assessment done of Valley of the Moon. There was an engineering assessment, an architectural assessment, a landscaping assessment. Essentially, what it all comes down to here is money, which is unfortunate because money was never George's focus at Valley of the Moon. He never charged admission, he never demanded donations, but he would accept them. What we need to restore Valley of the Moon entirely is about $500,000.
I think the first thing they can do is come out and visit. I think that if you haven't been to Valley of the Moon, you owe it to yourself to come out and be part of the magic. If a person is swayed to, we have positions for just about every kind of talent you can think of. We could sure use people that are willing to volunteer some of their time out here at Valley of the Moon. We could use donations. George never required a dime for his tours, but he did have a donation box. And that donation box is still here. We still are glad to have that stuffed. And basically get the word out about Valley of the Moon. We don't have an advertising budget, so you're not going to see big commercials that say, you know, splashy, come to Valley of the Moon with a new jingle that we have. We don't have the money for that. If we have money, we put it into keeping the buildings up or doing programming for children.
What Valley of the Moon needs most is support from the community. We need people's time. There's a volunteer job for everyone at Valley of the Moon. Whether they're children or adults, professionals, craftspeople, tradespeople, Valley of the Moon needs people's time in helping manage the place, repair the place, and keep the facility operational. Valley of the Moon also very much needs money. To fully restore this place would cost $500,000. And we don't have that kind of money. But we could with community support. And we do. When people come on free first Saturdays and they put a couple bucks in the donation bin, that helps us continue operating Valley of the Moon. And the last thing we need here is people's love. And really, I put it last because it's the most important thing we need. We need people to tell each other about Valley of the Moon and to share it with their families and bring each other to Valley of the Moon. It's a storybook land. It's the enchanted heart of the city of Tucson, and we just want to share it with people.
for the last 20 minutes we've been in here and we've just been talking about kindness and fairies and positive things. All of us probably have tragedy in our life. We probably have family members who are ill, or we're poor, or there's other problems going on. But in the last 20 minutes, that wasn't on our minds.
Where people are so busy and forget that life is simpler than we make it. That's what keeps me moonstruck, is knowing that there is somewhere to go where you can forget what's going on outside for a little while. When I'm here, I don't look at my watch. I don't know what time it is most of the time. I don't care. At home, I always know what time it is. But here, it doesn't matter.
And my friend was telling me that the intention of it was to create positive space, and I was observing, I thought it was really interesting how on the green area, even though there wasn't a major central activity, how everybody seemed engaged in the space, and like it affected everyone, seems like in a positive way. So yeah, It's been lovely. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Shannon, and this is my first time at Valley of the Moon, and we're enjoying the fairy lights. My name is Jan. We're here with my great-granddaughter and my granddaughter, and we're so happy there's a place like this to bring the kids.